Marcel Croteau signed up as a young man from northern Alberta to go into the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he became a rear air gunner. And if you know anything about that position, you'll know those folks didn't often live long. Well, Marcel beat the odds. Marcel Croteau flew 39 missions. He was decorated by King George VI and received many other medals for his service during the war. He came back to Canada, a husband, a father. He became an entrepreneur, a property developer, and a factory owner, an artist and a storyteller. But he carried with him the pain of the events of war, and it took a toll on him through his life. Recently, he met Lynda Manson. Lynda is also an artist, and she and Marcel got to talking, and Lynda realized that this was a book. She had to write this book about his experiences. Lynda Manson and Marcel Croteau both live on the Sunshine Coast, and they came into the studio to talk about this book, Conquering the War Within. And I started my conversation with Marcel, who has just turned 96, by the way, by asking him about that decision to become a rear air gunner.
Yes, at that time, tail gunners or rear gunners and that were supposed to only have a lifespan of 7 minutes and 3 seconds.
Not a promising future. Why on earth did you choose then to become a tail gunner?
I liked action. I was a very good horseman, and I liked difficult things to do. Yeah.
Well, so you chose.
Yeah, I didn't want to be in the army.
No?
No. Yeah, when I was younger, we had a World War One hired man. He was older. Every night he talked to me for an hour about how tough it had been in the trenches and stuff like this. I wasn't attracted to that kind of life. In the Air Force, we came back and we had white sheets, and stuff.
As long as you came back. Yeah,
right?
Yeah. You describe so vividly what that experience was like. Can you tell us a bit about what it was like hanging, sort of where you were positioned in the back of that plane, rattling along, looking backwards?
It wasn't always comfortable.
To say the least.
I took it seriously. We had training, and I took my training very seriously. I remember after the training at the Operational Training Unit in Stratford-on-Avon in England, the instructor told me that I would make it, that he thought I had done quite well. I wasn't really afraid of the enemy fighters. I never gave the opportunity of any of them to open fire on our aircraft. If they were too far, I gave evasive action. So again, this was the middle of the night in total darkness. And it was rather cold in the back there. It was about 70 below. I had to break the ice in my oxygen tube like this, take the ice off my eyelids and my eyebrows. And so that the turret wouldn't condense, I had to leave the 2 windows open on each side.
So you could see out?
Yeah, and we were going at 225 miles an hour. It was nice and cool.
It sounds terrifying.
You manage the fear. That's what courage is defined as, management of fear, not the absence of fear. I managed to survive mid-air collision and 3 airplane crashes in my life.
Lynda, what's it been like to hear the stories, to hear Marcel's stories, and hear about these, terrifying experiences?
It has actually been an incredible experience. One that I never would have planned because, I've never had this kind of an opportunity. But once Marcel and I started spending time together and I realized what an amazing story he had to tell. And because he is so articulate and has such an amazing memory for detail, and not only that, I mean, besides being a wonderful storyteller, he has an incredible sense of himself, a lot of self-awareness and compassion, and he's very intuitive as well. So, as we went along this journey, it became clear to me, and Marcel had actually mentioned, just sort of off the cuff, that, he had thought at some point in his life it would be great to get this all written down. And I, as we spent more time with each other, I realized how much that needed to be done, because his story is not just about the war, it's about his life. It's, in many ways, it's a history of Canada.
Growing up during the Depression and farming and, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And then the struggles that he had coming home after the war in adjusting to civilian life were profound. And he didn't have a lot of support. So a lot of his sort of acceptance and understanding has come from his own work on trying to figure out why he was feeling the way he was and how difficult things were for him. And so, it just became obvious this was a story that needed to be told, because I think it has a lot of universal meaning to it.
Marcel, tell me a bit about what it was like when you came back. You came back before it actually was over. It was still happening, and that was one thing that was hard, was to leave kind of in midstream, as it were.
They told me, you've done enough. I got discharged about 4 months before the war ended.
Right.
Yeah. That's when the Second World War for me started.
What's the nature of that war? What was that war?
The people, the young men that played farmers and stuff like this, to escape going to war, quite a few of them, and they resented us. They started to close the space. We didn't matter anymore. It was very difficult, even in your own circles, and that was the hardest part. That was harder than the war itself.
That feeling of being shut out, like you said. Yeah. Especially after all you'd been through.
Yeah. They would say, these war guys are not good for anything.
How did you manage?
The best I could. I saw that I couldn't really fit in that community. And I had sent half my pay home all the time I was in service, so I had a bit of money. And with my pilot overseas, we started an airline. There was a lot of trials and that too. A total of 8 months of operation. 2 airplanes gone. No more bank account.
Oh, gee. Gosh. Yeah.
Then I started working in different jobs. And at that time, people didn't know about PTSD, And I had difficulty adjusting to the climate of jobs and stuff like this, Being watched over, and I felt trapped. PTSD was not known, and I always had a pain in my solar plexus on the right-hand side. And just talking about the war, the pain is always there. Yeah, I've had it since the war, And there's not a day or an hour that you don't think about the war. The war never leaves you. You carry it with you the rest of your life. I was in combat for 1 year and won 7 air battles. I was awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal. I met King George, pinned it on my chest. I was a bit shy there, going in front of the royal family.
You mentioned that you'd been instructed how to respond, and then you kind of bunched it all together.
Yeah, and, it never turns out the way you figured.
Marcel, do you regret that you went?
No, not at all. Not at all. It had to be done. And, the minute the war broke out, I knew I was going to go. And I'm glad I did.
Even with all the pain after?
Yeah, well, you get an urge or a feeling that you have to be there, and that's what I did. I was ready for that. I was really ready for that,
The challenge.
Yeah.
Plus, you were a great problem solver. Lynda's nodding.
Yeah. Incredible problem solver.
The story opens with what you mentioned about the mid-air collision and this whole procedure that you were trying to go through, and the doorknobs came off in your hand as you were trying to escape the turret. But you just kept figuring out what to do.
Yeah, the handles were behind me, and there were just a little aluminum things, and I just pulled them off. Then I was trapped.
Then you were trapped in the turret, right?
And we were in a deadly flat spin. And I managed to turn around. There was no space there, but I managed to turn around and rip the doors off. And there were big steel pins holding it, up and down, So, and then when I had turned around, there was no room to turn around hardly there, And the centrifugal force of the spin got me down, and my parachute snaps caught into the rigging, and I was caught there. That was a long moment in my life.
Yes. I'm just trying to picture that, stuck there with this, like you say, spinning, and you could hardly move because of the pressure of that force.
Yeah. So I finally got loose, and by that time the pilot was just recovering. The aircraft had been damaged in the collision. The 20 feet of the starboard wing was bent at 17 degrees, and we had lost the outer starboard motor. And it was lurching. We didn't want to land, bail out over France. That was by Le Mans, France, 6 days before the invasion, where we're softening up German positions or enemy positions, So he fought it, and he fought it right back to Yorkshire and our own airfield. So it lurched and fell and come back up all the way back. Anyway, on landing, the wing went into the ground and the runway, and we hit it went off the runway, and then it stopped, and we didn't stay in there very long.
No.
We're right out.
But you managed to complete that mission, too.
Yeah, after the collision, we flew to the target, and we had a direct hit.
Lynda, just as you're listening, I notice, even though you know how this story ends.
When I heard it the first time, it just boggled the mind that anything like that could happen, and to think they all survived. But, with Marcel's storytelling ability, the story never gets old. Never. I always feel like I'm right there experiencing it.
I'm just thinking too, as Marcel as you were saying that, about what you were saying about courage, right? It's not being afraid, because you were all afraid, but it's managing that fear.
It's management. Courage is management of fear, not the absence of fear.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for coming in. Thank you for coming in to talk about this. It's such a remarkable book, and Lynda, like you say, it's such a ribbon, a distinct ribbon of history in this country. It's terrific to get a chance to read that. Thank you. Thank you, Marcel.
Thank you.
And thank you, Lynda.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.
My guests in this half hour, Lynda Manson and Marcel Croteau, and they were talking about the book they've worked on together called Conquering the War Within, Conversations with a World War II RCAF Rear Air Gunner. And I have to tell you that Marcel Croteau has the most astonishing memory for details, and the book also talks about his childhood on the farm and through the Depression, as well as his experiences in the air during the war and afterwards as well, and the effect that had on him for the rest of his life. As he mentioned, it's still with him in such a vivid and painful way. So my appreciation to both of them for offering this story. 3 minutes.